Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Motoyuki.
I'm Dr. Paul Kalnitz.
Welcome to Enliven Medicine, the channel where we explore holism, the nature of consciousness, and the future of medicine. If you find this video helpful, please give us a thumbs up and share with your friends. If you want to join our journey, hit subscribe as well as the notifications bell. Finally, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to post them below and we'll do our best to get back to you. Question from myself that I've been wondering about is in episode 3, we talked about the threefold human being and how we can divide basically the world into threes. And one thing I've heard is people have divided the face into these threes, and they associate the forehead with thinking, and this middle area, the nose, with like experiencing the world or feeling, and then the chin more with action. And I'm wondering if that kind of framework for thinking about someone's face, does that hold true in your experience? And could you actually, for our listeners, analyze my face just as a fun exercise? And of course, yeah. And listeners could feel free to pause the video too once they get the concept and, analyze for themselves. But
yeah. So episode 3 was about, and this was an idea that Rudolf Steiner really developed, but it's a very old idea. We see it in alchemy, and Paracelsus, the alchemist, spoke about salting forces in nature, and then sulfuric combustion forces and mercuric forces which mediate. So in a way, protochemistry saw that there weren't 92 elements plus elements in nature, but rather that these 3 primary principles. And they kind of work with the so-called 4 elements. They're related to that. So for example, the salting principle is the sort of earth and watery aspect. For example, how salts crystallize from water into a physical form. So those are the 3 principles. Now, they apply, I looked in episode 3 at how we can look at the body with the nerve sensory system and the metabolic system, and then a rhythmic system with the breathing and circulation as representative of those 3 processes as a whole. But the same threefold principle can be seen almost holographically in every part. So you mentioned the face, how we can think of the face as being threefold, where the part above the eye really kind of represents the true aspect of the nerve sensory pole. And on the soul level, I related how those go beyond physiology and how they relate also to our 3 primary soul actions. The soul or psyche, whatever you want to call it, our inner realm of experience, our emotions and whatnot. Really, we have 3 activities that go on there. We have thinking, conceptualization, that's mental pictures and representation and so forth. We have feeling, as you mentioned, and then will or action. Will is more like, you can say on a deeper level, like drives, what drives you. And, Rudolf Steiner, amongst others, described how these are 3 really separate activities. And so part of the process of inner development is to develop, for example, in thinking, the ability to feel and to will. In the will, the ability to feel and to think. And in feeling, the ability to think and to will. So there's a whole range of different inner exercises that one can cultivate for that. So going back to the face, the thinking or nerve sensory aspect would be, the forehead, the cranium. That would be the true, an image in the face of the nerve sensory activity. So and this is of course not to recommend that old science of phrenology that looked at bumps on the skull and you could tell everything from the bumps on the skull. It's more complicated than that. But, we can say that the nerve sensory activity, if you are more dominant in that nerve sensory activity, you're going to have a very high forehead and all that sort of thing. And that's related to the body types, the ectomorphic body type. And then we have that middle zone, which is more, related to the sinuses, lungs, kind of the image of the lungs there, and the nose itself. That this is related more to the rhythmical zone and the feeling life. So when we look at feelings, we're not so much focusing on someone's brow or the jaw. We looked at their cheekbones and how they're responding. When you get embarrassed or something, you flush in the face, and that's seen mostly around the cheeks and whatnot. So this is where we can read the feelings in a way of a person. And then the will aspect relates to the movable part of your skull, which is your jaw, and the mouth connected to the whole digestive apparatus and your metabolic system. So depending on the shape of your jaw, your forehead, all this, the idea is you can kind of get a sense of where someone's thinking, feeling, and will activity reside. So, again, this is more of an art than a science, right? So it kind of gives you some qualities, but we can look at body types, like in your case, there's the forehead, there's that ectomorphic kind of thinking activity that goes on there. Obviously a good feeling activity too. I mean, the smile and the cheeks and everything are there. I mean, the one maybe lesser developed aspect would be the jaw and the will activity, and the will to go through and do those things. So just based on that, we can maybe make some assessments of your inner nature, and that's something that can be helpful clinically to kind of look at patients. Obviously not using that alone as our diagnostic indicator, but maybe in addition to other things to tell us a little bit about, for one, organ systems. What are your organ systems doing? And this brings up some interesting correlations, like, when people have chronic sinusitis, for example, one approach is like, okay, well, there are bacteria and fungi and whatnot that grow there, so let's kill them and let's add antibiotics or herbal antimicrobials. And you hear this a lot at conferences. What's your favorite antimicrobial? Oh, I use colloidal silver, I use grapefruit seed extract, whatever it is. That is, we can say, one level of treatment. That's addressing the bug. But if we want to address the terrain and go deeper, you have to say that, what's happening in the sinus is a reflection of what's going on below in the body. And we have to start looking at not just the lungs and the heart, but also looking down in the metabolic system, looking at your digestive system, looking at how your liver's functioning and whatnot. So I had a case, for example, of really a woman with just years of chronic sinusitis, where she had surgery where they, essentially drilled through the skull to open up little openings to allow the sinuses to drain. And, she's still getting recurrent infections, recurrent rounds of antibiotics. She was getting rounds of antimicrobial herbs from another provider and these different things. And it wasn't until we focused on her liver system and kind of worked with her liver that her sinus issues resolved. And so that was, one of those ideas that, again, we can use the holographic principle to tell us, use the face as a whole map for the body, but then we need to back out and look at the whole body and look at what's going on there. And that really brings a different dimension to medicine. It's not just treating symptoms anymore or treating a germ or whatever. It's really supporting the terrain in that way. So that's maybe one way we can use face diagnosis to help us a bit.
So just to clarify, in that case, like, if you suspected, her primary problem was this chronic sinusitis, but it was due to a dysfunction in the liver, or partially. So how would you be able to, how could you maybe postulate that maybe the liver would be, weak from just looking at the face?
Right. So
apart from the color, but just the facial structure.
Yeah. So in, the kind of the liver, again, is a major central organ in your metabolic system. So we'd see it also playing out in the jaw, the oral mucosa, everything else. And, especially when the liver becomes kind of congested, you say fatty liver and whatnot, you tend to see a lot of adiposity that kind of accumulates down here. And she had a lot of, facial adiposity. Her neck was really thick and whatnot. And she had a history of, high triglycerides, high cholesterol, a little bit of insulin resistance. So the classic, what we call fatty livers potential picture there. And she had a higher BMI, so there was that weight element. So based on all that, we figured that was a good starting place, and it turned out in her case it was correct. I've had others where it was more related to the digestive sphere directly, so more needing to support the pancreas and the enzymes and whatnot. So that's, again, something I probably didn't get just from the face, And I was looking at the whole system, but you could potentially use the face in there as well.
Yeah. So let's say in my example, if my chin is maybe the most, I don't know if this is the right vocabulary, but retracted, everything else maybe, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Like what organs might be affected, or what do you
Right.
suspect would be most affected in that? Uh,
Well, the liver would be one, but the other kind of main metabolic system would be the kidney system, and working with the kidneys. And, you know, we say, and it's thought in, again, if we look at the connection between organs and the soul life, that each organ has aspects of the soul life like drive and will. And so the liver has more of a let's get it done today kind of will. Let's figure out what we need to do, plan it, strategize, and then carry out and do it. Whereas the kidney is more of a deeper drive. And so the kidney system is really important. And we can think of that working through the adrenal hormones as well as the kidney itself. And so if I was to say, okay, what system will we need to support in you? I would look at the kidney system. And then based on our previous discussions about the 4 life activities, you know, what aspect of the kidney system, more the warmth aspect, the inner light aspect, the tone ether aspect, or the yin life ether aspect. And, you know, in your case, I would, based on other indicators, I would think more about that inner light element. And so we'd say the kidney Qi. So kidney Qi deficiency would be something I would work on.
mm,
And there's certain herbs like astragalus and eleutherococcus and whatnot that in licorice that carry that activity or that stimulate that activity when you ingest those herbs.
and what, like, and I don't know, maybe you're using other
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
ideas now, but is there anything per se coming back to the face that would make you think of the light ether as?
Well, you know, you have a lot of inner, like light is something we experience. It's not obviously physical light, it's more of an emotional light. And there's a lot of emotional light there. But, you know, one thing you can notice in people, sometimes that light is either subdued or dispersed. And, you know, I think in your case, it might get dispersed a little bit too much. And so that's where, you know, then I would go back and look at the organ process that needs to be supported there. That kidney light process is really interesting when you approach it from, again, imaginative cognition, when you start to get out of just the intellect and thinking about hormones and, you know, kidney processes. But the kidneys really, and this would be a whole discussion in itself, are really there to obviously filter the blood. And so we talk about the kidneys as a giant filter. So it removes acids, it removes different organic wastes, it balances your pH, maintains your blood pressure, and it works primarily with sodium. So it maintains sodium balance. And by maintaining sodium, either letting it go or holding on to it, it can regulate water balance. So it's interesting with the kidneys, they don't primarily work with water. The one exception would be, for those of you who have gone deeper in physiology, antidiuretic hormone, which works on the kidney, the collecting duct. But that actually is secreted by the brain, by the pituitary. So it's not really, it's outside the kidney system. So the kidneys don't directly work with water, they work with sodium. And if you look at the inner nature of sodium, it's related more to the nervous system. You see, sodium represents the sympathetic. So the way I like to think of the kidney ultimately is that it's balancing the sympathetic animal activity with the parasympathetic, the rest and digest. So when you're very stressed and you have a very high sympathetic tone, the kidney system has to work that off, essentially, has to clean the blood of all that activity. And in doing so, you know, the kidney, again, this is part of a deeper discussion about kidney physiology, but you know, the kidney uses as much energy, you can say, as the brain in terms of cardiac output. It's a very high intensity organ energetically. And what it's really doing is not just filtering, it's actually in the glomerulus, it's dumping everything and then reabsorbing 99% of it. So the logic of the kidney is similar to if you had a broken chair in a room, the kidney would take all the chairs out into the hallway and then leave the broken one out there and bring all the good ones back in. Like from an engineering energy perspective, you'd say this is the stupidest thing ever. But in a way, we can say that's pointing to the kidney's real role is not an organ of excretion, but an organ of what we might call incretion. It's absorbing. It dumps all this waste, but then it reabsorbs it all. And in doing so, it's as if it charges it to another level. And in the language of anthroposophy, they actually argue that it's the kidney system that provides the basis for the soul life, for the astral body. That without the kidneys, they're constantly being vigilant. The soul could not connect with the physical body in the right way. So people that have very active inner soul life, maybe nervousness, or there's that sympathetic drive, are going to stress the kidney system. And that's something that, then we can address.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to make a couple connections here, actually several. So one, working backwards, the Chinese, or those in Chinese medicine, and of course you already know this, you're a trained acupuncturist, so I'm doing this mostly for listeners, but the kidneys are said to store the essence, or they call it Jing, and that is the physical substrate of spirit, or that which allows, it's just the physical substrate of it, and it's that part of us, like a physical substance, through which we can connect to these other kind of spiritual forces, or you might call the shens. So I think it's actually, my understanding is very similar.
Yeah, so that is definitely the view from Chinese medicine. I would argue that connecting with what I've been talking about, Jing in general, so in Chinese medicine, the concept of Jing is basically matter that has been enlivened with extra physical activity. I would argue, though, that Jing is matter that has been brought to the level of what we've been calling the etheric. So it's essentially like a colloid. In fact, that's how it's often described, like a stringy white. I mean, it's basically, if you extract DNA, it looks stringy white, kind of like what we call Jing or semen or something like that. It's basically water that's been taken to a different state. It's enlivened. That would be the Jing state. Now, that provides the basis then for these higher activities, including consciousness, which is what we relate to the astral body and the soul consciousness. And that would be the interaction with Jing and consciousness would now generate Qi. That would be that light activity. When you say spirit, that would be even outside just consciousness. That would be the capacity for self-consciousness, self-awareness. And in the anthroposophic circles and other circles, those are differentiated, consciousness versus self-consciousness. Say animals and humans have consciousness, but humans have this unique self-consciousness aspect, which works more through the warmth element, and that would be akin to Shen in Chinese medicine. So yes, the kidneys are very rich in that Jing element and that etherically charged element. So the kidneys need to have a lot of this etheric storage. Then they can become the basis of essentially working off the, as I mentioned in the first couple of lectures, we can think of the consciousness activity as having a very deadening aspect on life. So when you use your nerves, when you say we're stressed, you hinder your life forces. And so essentially just thinking, being in the nervous system in your awareness is causing damage to your life activities. That's just called being awake. That's like what we do during the day. We're in our consciousness, but it degenerates our life activities. And organs like the liver have to, deal with that, but then the kidneys have to really deal with that, especially when there's a lot of emotionally charged stress. And that's why stress and the whole cortisol cycle is so tied in with the kidney system. In fact, a lot of people talk about, cortisol, one of your major stress hormones, as kind of the villain. And we want to avoid cortisol and everything. I think that's not exactly true. If you think about so cortisol is a steroid hormone released by your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys like two little hats. And so when you're stressed, they release cortisol. Now, the the signal that tells them to release cortisol is actually from the brain, from the pituitary gland. So your brain perceives something as a stressor, causes all these changes, causes the release of a little peptide hormone into your blood called ACTH, which then goes down to your adrenals, circulates down in the blood, and then causes the adrenals to release cortisol. And unfortunately, with too much cortisol, we see all sorts of negative problems: high blood pressure, high blood sugar, you gain weight, all those kind of things. But without cortisol, and this happens in a disease known as Addison's disease, you would die very quickly, because cortisol is actually needed to protect you from the unmitigated effects from the nervous system, all that nerve activity. So in a way, the kidneys and secreting cortisol are trying to heal you from too much nerve activity. So it's like this two ends of a battery. So I think of the brain often in the kidney system as a battery. And when you have all of this activity in the central nervous system, it's the kidneys that have to work off that stress. And they do that by cleansing the blood of all these waste products, neurotransmitter waste, nitrogen waste in particular, and so forth. So in the language of the phenomenological chemistry that I gave last time, nitrogen is part of the air process. And the air element, air phase gas, is connected with the light activity. So in the anthroposophic system, Steiner often described his inner vision that the kidneys essentially are throwing off inner light that shines back towards the brain. And in fact, he argued in some animals that light goes right through the top of the head and creates antlers. So the antlers are really crystallized light that's come from the kidney system. And if you slice open an antler, it's actually rich in steroid hormones, adrenal steroids and sex steroids. If you castrate a male deer, it won't grow its horns. So in a way, the kidney system, which includes the kidneys, but also the gonads, is raying up this inner light back towards the brain. In humans, we don't see it coming out to the top of the head, although we have descriptions of it, like in Greek mythology, there's Bacchus, the party animal. He's very horny. He has the horns, which are the kidney energy coming up, the sexual energy coming up. We usually see it reflected in someone's eyes, the sparkle, kind of the inner essence of the eyes. That would be that kidney energy coming out at you. So I think it's a lot more than Jing. I think the Jing is just the basis of that, but then you have on top of that the Qi and the Shen forces that have to work in. So it's a little more complicated, I think, when you see it from the energy body perspective.
Yeah, well, that's, I will say, just as an aside, I will just say, I've been diagnosed in the 5-element tradition. And for those listening who don't know, it's the style of acupuncture pioneered by a guy called J.R. Worsley. And their primary form of treatment is to diagnose an elemental imbalance that, according to their system, has been there since birth. And there's a sound and a color that's like emitted, associated with it. People train themselves to be able to sense these things, or even the tone of someone's voice might indicate what is maybe has a tendency to go out of balance within themselves. And in that tradition, I've been diagnosed as a water, call a causative factor. So that fits with your assessment of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's nice when all these different approaches kind of arrive at a similar kind of understanding. I would go a little deeper in you and say that that kidney aspect is, again, stressed because of a strong central nervous system activity. And that really plays out in terms of an overactivity in what we might call the lung sphere, the so-called metal element. And so that would be essentially weakening the kidney sphere. And so that's why the kidney sphere comes out. And that's why I'm not, just as a little side, I differ a bit from the Worsley school because of that, because I don't think there's one causative factor. I think there is usually these complex networks of interconnected organs where one is overactive and stresses another. And often that's coming out is the main problem, but sometimes the problem is really upstream more. So we have to think more about that. So, it's easy, to have a system, you classify people and then you're done with it and whatever. I think it's important to try to back up and understand, what's this really saying? How is this playing out in terms of physiology? And then it gives you a broader perspective. So it's a little different there than the Worsley approach.
Yeah. But anyways, it's yeah, interesting to get into the kidney physiology as well. And
yeah, the kidneys are a fascinating organ. I mean, there's a lot we can say about that. Just talking about the holographic homologies in the body, essentially going back to the threefolding principle, the nerve sensory activity, the metabolic, and the rhythmic. We can find that the nerve sensory activity is mostly concentrated in the head. Of course, there is also rhythmic and metabolic activity here as well. So we can look at all the glial cells, the so-called supporting cells of the neurons, as being an aspect of the metabolic system. That makes up a lot of what we call the gray matter in the brain, versus the white matter, which is the axons, the myelinated axons, is more the true nerve activity. So even in the brain, we have that. And what we find in conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is a degeneration of the white matter because it's not being properly supported by the gray matter. The metabolic system is not able to clean up the metabolic waste and whatnot appropriately. So you get all these misfolded proteins that are tangled up, and they damage the neurons, the nerve cells. So we have a metabolic system there. We also have a nerve sensory system in the gut. But each of these three spheres, the head, the sort of thorax, and abdomen, we can say are separate systems. It's like we're a human snowman in a way that's been put together. And what happens in metabolism is directly reflected up in the head and vice versa. And we have, of course, this emerging science of the gut-brain connection, which is showing us these things. But the way Rudolf Steiner described it is actually what happens in the gut is as if holographically transmitted to the head and vice versa. You don't need nerve pathways. And it happens instantaneously. It kind of harkens back to this idea of those quantum forces we talked about. But for example, any sort of metabolic change in the gut is going to have a reflection in the head pole. And that's where headaches and whatnot, we often have to think of, well, we can look at them as head phenomena, but we can also look at them as metabolic phenomena and vice versa. We can also see just at the very structure of anatomy that every organ in metabolism is actually reflected in the head. So for instance, if you just open up the skull and look in at the brain, it looks like the convolutions of if you open up your abdomen and look at your small intestine, they look the same. It's just that in the nervous system, the tissue is filled in, except for the hollow ventricles, but the nerve matter is solid, versus in the intestines, it's hollow. And we remove that waste in a way. So in a way, the brain is where the waste has not been removed. Kind of like this idea of shit for brains, I guess, right? you retain the material, versus in metabolism, you push it out. And that gives us the basis of will to separate something, to do something, versus in the brain, we're just reflecting and using our thoughts. So in a way, the cerebrum can be likened to the small intestine. And then the large intestine really is expressed more in the frontal lobe. And something that Steiner also indicated, which is interesting, is that we can compare in mammals the length of the colon with the size and the development of the frontal cortex. And he said there's a relationship there. No one that I've known has done a study on this, but that would be interesting to actually compare. So all the aspects of the frontal cortex, which is our executive center and our higher thinking, say it's reflected in metabolism in your large intestine and all of its metabolic activity. Well, if we look at the kidney system, we have the kidneys and then the ureters, which drain the urine into the bladder. So we have this kind of system down below. If we look up above, we find this interesting homology between the ears, the eustachian tubes, and the throat. In fact, embryologically, the kidney system begins in the neck, and then it migrates downward. So this connection between the throat, for example, and the bladder is made in anthroposophic medicine, where they will often use therapies like injectable therapies. They do low dose herbal and other injections, subcutaneous in the body as therapy. They'll inject over the bladder for pharyngitis or something like that. And it's, it's interesting to see how, the kidney is involved. There's a high connection between the kidney system and the pharynx. So for example, in post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, you get inflammation in the kidneys after a strep infection. And so the throat kidney is connected in that way. So that likens to Chinese medicine, which say that the kidney expresses in the ears. You're right. Yeah.
Well, and you look at the channel system, and it goes right up through the throat.
Right.
In even various extra collateral channels of the kidneys, or that are said to come from the kidneys, also go through, that area of the throat.
That's right. So it gives a deeper, it's kind of like we have this head and we have the other organs. How do they fit together? Well, if you start to see that everything that's in metabolism is reflected in the head and vice versa, it opens up some interesting avenues of approach. There's another connection with the kidneys, and that's in the brain. There's an area called the amygdala. There's they look like little peach bits on either side. And it's essentially a center in the brain that's connected with our fear centers. So when you stimulate the amygdala in animals, they launch into fear. And we think a lot of anxiety, panic attacks, and whatnot are related to overactivation of the amygdala. And so interestingly, medications like SSRIs, Prozac and Zoloft, and those kind of things, they one action we think is they quiet the amygdala, so that it's not so responsive. Well, interestingly, if you just do a section, it's like just kind of look at do what's called a coronal section of the face and look at where the amygdala are and map the whole body onto that, you'd find the amygdala are exactly at the region of the kidneys on that mapping. So we can think that in the brain, the amygdala are where information from the kidney system is essentially mapped. And there's some evidence for this building that nerve pathways from the kidney, for example, through vagal nerve pathways, are coming up and they map into different parts of the brain. And I haven't seen a specific connection with the amygdala and the kidneys, but I wouldn't be surprised if we'll find that. So that we see this lighting up, we're like, oh, your amygdala is why you're anxious. But really the problem is down in the kidneys. You're not properly balancing your sodium or phosphorus or some other electrolyte, very minute-to-minute changes. And as a result, you're feeling anxious. You're getting a panic attack. And so you're like, wow, what do I do about this? Well, you can treat the kidney system. And once you treat the kidney system, and this again is that deeper connection between organs and mental health, essentially that starts to change. So the psyche is not just in the brain, it's throughout the whole body, in the organs. But we can think of the head system, the thorax, and the metabolic system as really three separate human beings squashed together. And so whenever you have a problem in one end, sometimes it's helpful to look at the other end and to do treatments on the other end in a way. So just one little nugget there to maybe think about. I found that to be very true with, again, sinusitis, migraines, a lot of the mental health conditions. Often they're not in the head. They're starting down in your liver, your kidneys, your intestines. And so that's where we can direct our therapy.
Yeah. I mean, I'm over here in Chinese medicine realm where there is a direct connection, not only one between the kidneys and the brain, but between the kidney system and the emotion of fear. And,
right. Exactly. Yeah.
It does seem like a lot of Western science is potentially, and I'm not saying it's gonna for sure go in this direction, but starting to rediscover in a more precise way some of these connections that the Chinese were postulating for
Well, I would argue that they're in Chinese medicine because, before some of the earliest classics we have written down, we think that, for example, some of the earliest classics were written around 200 BC and then later. Before that, there isn't a lot written down. That's not to say there weren't oral traditions that had that, but we can say there was a time when people had a cognition at a higher level of what's going on in these different, more subtle bodies, the etheric and the astral and whatnot. And in those bodies, you see more of a connection, like I've just been talking about, between these different areas. And we can observe a person that's fearful and see what's going on in their kidney system. And, you can see a change there. That type of cognition was lost, and we fell more and more into physical cognition. So we're just looking at what we can see with our physical eyes and using intellectual cognition. So I think we're coming back to that again, starting to see these higher and higher order connections in the body as we get more into system science and that sort of thing. So in a way, yes, I think it will come at that old understanding from a different angle. I think one of the problems that we have in Chinese medicine is you're told all this, but then why? And I know that's in anything in science. No one's out there repeating all the experiments in physics to understand physics. You're learning in a book, and someone told you this is how electromagnetism works or whatever. But in a way, you could go back and figure that out. In a way, in Chinese medicine, it's like, well, why is the kidney fear? Why is the liver anger? And I always, personally, I felt there was, something missing in that. But when I can now go and understand the physiology a little bit better and how it's connected with the psyche, then it gives a bit more of an understanding, I think. And so I think it's helpful to augment Chinese medicine with maybe these other approaches as well, to give maybe a fuller picture. And we might find in some instances that maybe some things that were observed a couple thousand years ago maybe aren't as connected today. So one difference is, when a lot of stress in Chinese medicine is often discussed as really affecting the liver system, more so than the kidney system. And we can argue, well, maybe there's been a change in human physiology. Maybe their stress is affecting people differently. These are things to reflect on, and that might change our therapies a little bit. So just more food for thought.
Yeah. Well, I guess we have to, that begs the question, like, what are the, I guess, kinds of insults as people may be experiencing more so now than even 100 years ago? Like, if we're talking about the kidneys as related to thinking, or a kind of thinking, or even regulating and helping cool down the thinking, the more nervous activity, thinking activity, and then I mean, it would make me think, if we're seeing more kidney problems, are we seeing this excess of the thinking activities as in general?
Yeah.
I know we've had a much deeper discussion about this too, like, some tradition, we relate kidneys to creativity, but I think I'm just throwing that into the box, and a lack of creativity being trained within ourselves to be able to balance out these more incoherent thoughts. So anyways.
So I think it's maybe a little clarity could help here. So I was talking about how the central nervous system and the kidneys can be seen as kind of two ends of a battery this way, but to be a little bit more precise, there's one aspect of the nervous system that the kidney system really works with, and that's the sympathetics. That's your fight or flight response. And that's connected more with your emotional life, not as much with the thinking life. In fact, we asked, what is the organ that deals with just supplying the brain for nutrients for thinking? The brain uses primarily glucose. That's the liver. That's where the liver system comes in. But for the emotional life, the kidney system is primarily there to balance off the excess emotions. And that's an old herbal medicine saying that the kidneys work off the emotions. And so we say that when you have a very high sympathetic stress, sympathetic nervous system stress, fight or flight, adrenaline, all that, that the kidneys become involved in trying to regulate that. And and they do that by maintaining blood pressure and so forth. And sometimes they can't quite keep up with that. They become overstressed, and now your blood pressure starts to go up because they're not properly regulating all of this. We can say that the astral body is too engaged in the kidney system. It's becoming too overactive there. So I think with stressors, with fight or flight response, all that, the kidney system is definitely taking a hit. And and that's really, again, ties in with that whole modern discussion of cortisol. You know, we often don't talk, though, in the cortisol argument about what's happening in the kidney itself, you know, what's going on with its ability to manage sodium and these different things. And that's an important aspect to not forget, that the kidneys become affected by stress as well. You know, one way to study the organs, and we can get into this in future discussions, is to go and study people who, observe people who have end organ problems, like in dialysis clinic with chronic renal failure, to study what kinds of changes in cognition and whatnot they have. And what you find there is that people tend to have, you know, cognition in general is, before dialysis treatments, is blurred, but also that emotional ability to really work with regulate the emotional expression can be challenged a lot. So yeah, I think the kidneys work with that fear element, with emotions, the emotional state, more deeply than with just thinking from the central nervous system. So yeah, so we can say that depending on your temperament and where you're living, you're going to stress different organs based on that activity. And then that clinically can give you a little hint as to which organ systems do we need to support and how can we support them appropriately. So it's yeah, it's not too different than our modern thinking about stress and all that. But I would say that today, yeah, more people are maybe more affected through the kidney system than they are through the liver system. And whereas maybe 500 years ago, people were more affected through the liver system. I don't know. You know, that's kind of interesting to think about.
So yeah, so I wonder, like, a lot of these stress reducing therapies, like you know, meditation, deep breathing exercises, putting your feet on the ground, doing some hobby that's just different than whatever, you know, the rest of your life looks like, or just having a period of time with nothing planned where you can just be open to things. I wonder if those are all, to some extent, working with the kidney system in a way, or like how much of the therapeutic aspect of those activities is related to the kidneys.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think that, you know, when you're, again, we have to look at all four of these bodies that we kind of talked about a couple of episodes ago, you know, the physical, the etheric, your life activities, which we've been spending a couple of episodes now on. And then your psyche, which is connected with the so-called astral body or astrality, call it your animal body or just the psyche, that's an actual body in a way, not in physical space per se. It actually works through different forces. And we have yet to talk about those, but those would be your psychic forces. And that's where your emotions are, but also the stressors and everything are kind of in that realm. And then we have our mental forces, which are connected to what you might call your higher spirit. So, and this is something interesting to reflect on. You know, there's people tend to, in the especially integrated medicine, thoughts tend to be downplayed from emotions. We talk about how feelings are more important than your thoughts. And that's talking more about intellectual thoughts. So yeah, intellectual thoughts can be very dry. They can distill the emotion out. And so you can become insensitive in that way to the emotion. But the kind of thinking that, for example, I'm discussing here is more enlivened thinking, that thoughts actually are, in a way, something we all share between each other. So you might be depressed and I might be depressed, but we don't actually know if our depressions are the same, right? I can talk about it, you can talk about it. Versus with thoughts, when I talk about a triangle or this thing I went to the other day or something, you can get a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about there. So there's a universality to thinking, not so much with emotions. I know that's a hard one for, I think, a lot of people to hear because they want to make emotions primary in a sense. But, you can say the emotions are part of the psychic forces. They're very important. They're above the life activities and the physical activities. But then the mental, the thought forces are even higher than that. And so when you, for example, do mindfulness or whatnot, what you're really doing is say, I'm going to go to that mental realm, essentially going to surrender into it in a way. In a sense, that gives you this capacity to more fully observe the psychic forces. That part of you call your witness, that inner part that you use to observe the world in a way, is at that mental realm. In the Sanskrit, it's called Jivatman. This is sort of the reflection of even higher spirit realms into the mental world. And from there, we kind of look out upon the astral and the emotional world and down even to the etheric and the physical. So in a sense, when you're doing mindfulness, you're essentially you're getting out of being connected too much with the astral. That's more coming from the lower mind or your ego. And you're moving up to this higher witnessing place. And in doing so, you can then see the astral patterns more clearly and you can work with them. And so then the astral patterns no longer have the stressors on the organs. They're no longer overtaxing that organ system. So the etheric activity can regenerate appropriately. So I think that's the ultimate way to deal with a lot of these stressors, is to be able to witness them. And in witnessing them, it kind of releases the pattern, and then that releases the grip on the organ. And now the proper etheric forces can flow in and repair it. That's kind of the way of thinking in the kind of anthroposophic circles about these things. So so I think there's a definite role when you're doing that. But I think it's not just the kidneys you're healing there. It's all the organs ultimately.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it sounds like it's much more involved, and the process is to be able to open ourselves up enough to be able to sit with maybe the difficult things or emotions that maybe we're not looking at, but that are still nonetheless driving our behavior in these significant ways.
That's right. That's right. So I think, more and more, when you work in the clinic, you see this pretty clearly that, yes, diet and toxins and EMFs and all this have an effect on health for sure. But the emotional realm is probably the biggest, so, our feeling patterns, traumas, all these things have a potentially devastating effect on your physiology. So in other words, the psyche catabolizes the physiology. It's like an animal eating. If you liken the physiology to your plant body, your inner plant, your plant soul, the animal body, the astral body would be, you say, eating the plant. So our psyche is constantly eating the life forces away. And I found clinically it's helpful then to identify where is that eating process happening the most and how can we support that. Now, that's one level. The next level would be to say, well, how do we get to a place where you can release that astral pattern? How can you transform it? That's where you have to get maybe into this higher witnessing place. And I think a lot of treatments like acupuncture, when you relax, you get into the parasympathetic state where your life activities are enhanced. Then you're able to maybe witness more clearly what's going on in the psyche. Versus your regular day-to-day life, you're too much in it. This really relates back to, we can say on a physiologic level, the different states of brainwaves. We have these 4 different patterns of brainwaves, well, 5 actually. Our normal everyday, day-to-day thinking is a so-called beta brainwave state. And then we slow the brainwaves down, we get into alpha when we're relaxed, somewhere between 7 and 14 hertz cycles per second. And then, whereas beta is like 14, 15, up to 30 cycles per second. And then, and this is done by looking at EEG readings. We're averaging all the neural electrical signals and looking at their waveforms. So beta is everyday thinking. And in that beta state, you are actually secreting stress hormones. You're catabolizing the body. And so in that brainwave state, you don't heal. If you're injured, you can't heal when you're in a beta brainwave state. In fact, it's very interesting when you're really stressed, then it completely shuts off your healing processes. And I think it's interesting how we glorify, like in the media, when we talk about medicine, it's always emergency medicine that's really kind of glorified. No one wants to do a show on primary care medicine like this. It'd be too boring for people. But, like surgery or, ER medicine, this high intensity trauma medicine, you're in beta brainwave, no healing is going to happen there. So it's like no one heals in the ER, right? You got all these monitors going off, you got these sounds, you're in beta brainwaves the whole time. When you slip into alpha, which is what you do when you kind of relax a little bit, you're reading a book, having a cup of tea. And some people, when they're watching TV, they go into alpha. And in alpha, you're starting to heal. You're able to actually get out of that stress mode a little bit. You're also more susceptible to things coming in. So that can be helpful life activities. That can also be like in watching TV and a little media blips come in and you're more susceptible to now, you can say, getting into your psyche, these activities. When you usually go to sleep, in the first kind of stages of sleep, you fall into what are called theta rhythms, which are around 3.5 hertz up to 7 hertz or so. I'm rounding these numbers. And in theta rhythms, you are really healing. You're starting to get into that healing state. And then finally in deep sleep, slow wave sleep, we get into what's called the delta rhythms. And those are very slow brain waves. And what you find is that all the different neurons are actually firing in sync and synchronized. So there's more of a coherence. And that is an ultimate healing state right there. So, but most people in those last two brainwave states fall asleep. So what you're really talking about with your meditative activities is how do we consciously move from a beta brainwave state down into alpha and then down into theta and delta. Now, some meditators can stay awake in theta. A few can actually stay awake in delta. That's very difficult to do, but you can, with training, cultivate that. There's a fifth brainwave state, and that's higher than 30 cycles per second. They're called gamma bursts. And this happens with very high attention, but like almost ecstatic kind of activities that can happen there as well. But for healing, we really want to get into these much slower brainwave states. And what you just talked about is a way of essentially accessing them through meditation.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, this is something I've been meaning to ask you about for a long time, and the brain waves and the different kinds. And I want to, as I ask this question, I'm just going to share my screen quickly so viewers can see maybe an image of different brain waves, so they can just, here's the different ones we're talking about. But and maybe I'll make this bigger for whatever people can see, whatever's on my desktop. That's okay. But what even was my question? So I'm wondering, like, just what would be the experience of a gamma wave state per se? And I know, well, okay, this is the first question, but before we even get to that question, I will say I've read like some really amazing papers where they've compared like advanced meditation to states of hibernation, where people are able to, meditate for 30 minutes, but get the amount of like rejuvenation as if they had slept for at least 2 hours or longer.
Right. Yeah, right. So this is, maybe you can pull up an image of the sleep cycle in brainwaves. This might help us explain that a little bit better. Interactive thing here. Yeah.
Yeah, here we go. Maybe
How about down? Let's see. So down, down, down. That one. Nope,
this
nope.
one.
With the blue background.
Ah, this one.
Yep. Hmm.
Great. Let's make it bigger. Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Go to the website and there you
okay.
go. Yeah. So, awake is the beta brain waves that are there. So, what you're seeing there is a scale of hours that's along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and then these four different stages of sleep. So awake is beta brain waves, and that's in your normal waking consciousness. And then when you go to sleep, you get relaxed, and that sets you down into alpha, which is what they're calling stage 1 sleep here, alpha rhythms. And most people at this point are still somewhat awake, and then you get into low alpha and high theta, and that's when we go into stage 2 sleep, going down, and then eventually you get into what's called slow wave sleep. So what we're calling stage 3 and stage 4 in this diagram has now been renamed slow wave sleep, and that is delta rhythms. So you notice stage 4, the waveforms are very high amplitude and they're slower. So it's like what's happening here is that versus the waking state in beta, in the slow wave sleep, it's like all your neurons are firing together in synchrony. They're harmonized and they're more attuned, and that's where that amplitude comes out. Notice it takes about 30 minutes or so to go from awake down to stage 4. So if you look at the time, so they're showing up to an hour. Yeah, that first divot right there. And then you pop up, usually within 90 minutes, you go up to back to stage 1, and you're essentially in beta brainwaves, although your brainstem is paralyzing all of your motor impulses. So you can't move the body, but your eyes are darting back rapidly, and that's the so-called REM sleep. And if you wake people up during that state, they usually report they've been dreaming. Versus if you wake them up back at slow wave sleep, they'll say, yeah, down there, they usually don't remember dreaming. That's not 100%, but that's roughly. Um, so, and then notice you go from the REM sleep back up at the top there, go to the left one there. Oh, no, back. The first REM, yeah. And then you go back down to the slow wave, and then you go back up to REM, and you go back to just like stage 3 or upper slow wave, and then back up to REM. And you do this cycle about 5 times a night on average in an 8-hour sleep. But the first 2 are the deepest when you go into slow wave sleep. Now, most people have heard of REM sleep as the kind of good sleep and it consolidates your memories. Actually, during REM, you're secreting stress hormones. So REM is actually not for the physical body, not that rejuvenative. It's actually the slow wave sleep down at stage 4 there that you heal. In fact, in those states, you actually are secreting lots of growth hormone. In fact, adults secrete most of the growth hormone during those 2 10-minute or 15-minute slow wave dips each night. That's when most of your adult growth hormone is secreted. Babies are usually in that state for 23 hours a day, so they're secreting lots of growth hormone. And then DHEA is another anabolic steroid from your adrenal glands, and that's also secreted in that during that time. So our regenerative, rejuvenative, healing hormones are secreted mostly during the slow wave sleep. Versus REM, we actually don't regenerate the body as much. So what this is really saying is that during our waking consciousness and then REM and beta brain waves, we're in our nervous system, but we're not healing the body that well. And it's only when you get into the slow wave sleep, or if you're a meditator, if you get down into the theta and then potentially delta rhythms, if you can stay awake, then you're actually rejuvenating the body. And you don't need to sleep because you're actually doing it kind of what the body does normally at night. So at night, we can say we're in slow wave sleep. Our etheric forces are coming awake, are being activated now. The astral consciousness forces are lifting away, and they're allowing the etheric forces to regenerate. So without sleep, we essentially would just deteriorate. and die pretty quickly. Caffeine kind of works by tricking the brain into thinking that it doesn't need sleep. But that only works for a certain period of time, and then it's actually blocking. There's yeah, ATP as it's used up. You get a bunch of the building block is adenosine, and you get a bunch of adenosine building up, and that normally should tell the nerves, okay, we need to sleep to clear all this out. And what happens during sleep is that the cerebral spinal fluid, actually the neurons literally start to normally during waking consciousness, they're very tightly packed together. And during sleep, they actually relax a little, and cerebral spinal fluid washes through all the nerve spaces, basically, and carries away waste products and whatnot. And we now know there's a whole lymphatic system that's there, the so-called lymphatic system, that helps clean all this away. So during sleep, you're cleaning out waste products, you're doing all this, but that can only happen if you're in those low frequency states. And so any practice that helps you get there, even during wakefulness, will help you heal. And that's why some of these meditators claim they don't need to sleep, because they're essentially not taxing their body in the same way that the rest of us are, being in beta brainwave all day long.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I should maybe I'll ask the new question. I should just go back to about gamma waves. But I'm wondering with caffeine, so it sounds like, and again, this is for listeners and for those that don't know, I wrote a whole ebook and did my whole undergraduate thesis on caffeine. And, I had a little bit of a negative bias, but I've been exposed to so many perspectives since then that I'm, still exploring and seeing if there's a middle ground to stand on. But I'm wondering, is there, if caffeine is working by like, in a way, like adenosine builds up, we feel tired. It's a byproduct of ATP breakdown. And caffeine, it goes into the receptors for adenosine and like stops the body from processing the adenosine, but that allows the brain to, or the body to continue releasing more and more dopamine, serotonin, stress hormones, epinephrine. So it seems like there's more. So given that idea, I'm wondering, and I hate to have like moral, but would it be an incorrect relationship if we're relying on caffeine for energy when we get tired? And if so, like, is there a, I know there's no one right answer to this question, but I'm just.
Well, I mean, so we can look at what it does. So usually when you say caffeine, no one is out there taking straight caffeine. They're taking it in something like tea or coffee, right? There's a few that maybe are doing like a soft drink, which is caffeine added. So yeah, caffeine essentially is tricking the neurons into thinking, oh, you don't need to, clean out all this adenosine. You don't need to make more ATP. You got plenty of it. So keep firing, keep going. So it's like whipping a tired horse. You just keep pushing. Eventually, you get to a point where it won't work anymore. And so we do hit a wall with caffeine. So caffeine is really emphasizing that nerve sensory activity. Now, when you drink a beverage like coffee, it's more complicated because you have caffeine in there, but you also have all these other compounds. And that's where it gets interesting, because now the data on coffee is actually really positive. That essentially it is protective against a lot of different illnesses. And it seems to be, up to a point, dose dependent. So the more you drink up to a point, the better. And we think that's partly because in coffee you have all of these protected polyphenols and so forth. A lot of these are antioxidant. So they're actually, nature has given us this incredible beverage, where we have the caffeine to stimulate the nerve sensory activity and the polyphenols to stimulate the life activity. So they're both coming together. versus if you just take the caffeine out and take that, that's a whole different experience. If you've ever just tried straight caffeine, it's very different than, you know, drinking a cup of coffee. In tea, even more so, there's less caffeine and more of these protected polyphenols and so forth. So in green tea in particular, so you're getting some great benefits from that. So yeah, so coffee definitely, I mean, caffeine definitely influences that catabolic nerve sensory pole, which in the end increases aging and whatnot. But then these other things in the beverage, in a way, are counteracting that. And that's why I think it's, you know, so easy to, okay, well, we got to avoid this and avoid that, and you know, I don't think that's really healthy. I think it's understand what an effect is of something like coffee or whatever, and then, you know, moderate it as you need to. But you don't have to be like militant about avoiding or this sort of thing. I think that creates more of a mental paralysis in people rather than being healing in any sense. And you know, that's a whole maybe different discussion about diet and where we can go there and the problems that can arise from that. But
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that I've still been sitting with, is like the nature of addiction. Like I've been very much all or nothing. Like that's in my long and tumultuous relationship with coffee, it's always been like all or nothing, and I can't find the middle ground. And I've wondered, well, you know, and this is just coming up today, but like how much is not being able to let go of something just as much of an addiction as being totally fixed on pushing that thing away?
well, I would argue, yeah. I mean, I think that's, I mean, both sides are part of the same phenomena. It's a sort of rigidity, you know, it's either yes or no binary, but you know, the healthy place often is in the middle. It's looking at how we can, you know, a little cup of coffee here is okay, you know, or if I go to dinner and someone serves me some coffee, I'm not going to make a big stink about drinking it. Now, everyone's going to have to make their own decisions about that, obviously. But, you know, it's, I think there's a health aspect in being flexible, you know, and, you know, having a drink, but, you know, not having the drink rule you in a certain way. I mean, what a lot of these things, addictions, are doing is essentially replacing yourself. So when we say drugs, and a lot of these addictive substances have alkaloids, those nitrogen-bearing compounds we talked about, that these drugs really replace an aspect of yourself. It's like a foreign astrality comes into you, and you know, it takes over your own sense of I, your own being. What you're really saying by saying, I'll never have that again, is to say, you know, I'm kind of scared that my I is not going to be strong enough to avoid this. So I'm just going to avoid it entirely. And that's sometimes necessary to just get over it. And if you've had obviously a severe addiction, you know, it's not going to be something you can necessarily take a little bit of and work with. But I think, you know, there is a healthy spot to be flexible around, you know, recognizing what that is, and saying, okay, in place of that, I'm going to strengthen my I. I'm going to strengthen my Shen, my inner warmth, to kind of work with that. And, you know, that's really where, on a highest level, we can say we're really working with love. You know, we connect with that inner feeling of love for ourselves and whatnot, and that often then fills in that hole that other substance was replacing. In a way, those substances are replacing an aspect of ourself that we have not cultivated. And so just avoiding it doesn't necessarily heal it. That hole remains. You also have to do that inner work to heal that hole. And that sometimes can be from a foreign psychic pattern that's set up within you and that needs to be transformed. Or that could be from, you know, where you have not fully engaged in something. That's usually what happens, is we get these foreign psychic patterns, and then that observing part of ourselves just looks away. I don't want to look at that. You know, we avoid it. It's like pain. You don't want to go into pain. I mean, that's what most people are thinking. You want to avoid the pain. Give me a painkiller or whatever. As opposed to, let me go into the pain. Let me experience it. Let me see what comes out. I mean, that's very difficult to do. But often when you do that, you realize, oh, first of all, it's not as scary as I thought. And secondly, as you observe it, it transforms. It's almost like taking warmth to it in your attention and melting it. Uh, that's more of a phenomenological way of maybe talking about it. But you're transforming it in that process. And then it can no longer have that same grip on you. So I think, just avoiding something without healing, why is it that you became so addicted? What is that inner process it was trying to fill? That can be just as unhealthy as, doing the addiction. So I think, obviously you're going to have to, with any person, find the right balance there. But I think, avoiding the substance, great, but then also look at why that addiction happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, guess then you avoid the danger of just something else equally, but perhaps less on the surface destructive, replacing,
And that happens a lot, where a person who's maybe an alcoholic then replaces that, stops drinking, but then that problem is not there. And then they maybe replace it with something else like gambling or sex or something like that. And that's just the same addiction kind of transformed in a different place. So, these are difficult issues. And again, it's really important not to stigmatize or generalize, and we have to sort of try to understand what's going on with each person individually. But yeah, I do find a lot of the kind of abstinence can, in some cases, be just as, unhealthy as, partaking in something.
Yeah. Well, it's just, I mean, it's so interesting to me how what maybe is driving addiction could be something as simple as like a particular behavior, or like my tendency to overcommit to things and then become resentful because of that. And that may in turn be driving, a tendency to drink too much coffee because I've overcommitted to things. So I need to like move more,
Right.
energy than maybe I actually have to give, or that's sustainable. And so there's like something underneath that's driving the other thing, or I'm too afraid to communicate my emotions to other people, and so I'll go and connect with my cat, or I'll go smoke weed so that I can be connected to something, but I don't have to look at like, I don't have to do the hard work of having to like state how I really feel, and
It's hard peering into your astral body. I mean, it's definitely difficult work. It can be exhausting, and I think there's nothing wrong with like occasionally distracting yourself from that. You kind of have to. In fact, that's sometimes to survive, you have to do that. And so no one that does that should be blamed for doing that. However, when it becomes a pattern, when you can't do the inner work, then that's something to look at.
mm. Well, it's good to have a middle ground.
Ultimately, that is the balance. It's like, again, going back to the three primary forces, the salting, the mercury, the sulfur. The mercury forces, the balancing, is where the healing is. Again, this is the solution, I think, to our society, which is very much based on polarities right now. Our whole binary digital culture has to find that middle ground, the gray zone, the 1.5 or the 0.5, and not just 0 or 1, like what's in between and all the other shades in between there. And it's difficult to maintain that, in the swing of things. But this is where higher truth comes out, a higher understanding is when you can hold both poles, like in someone arguing, politically. You have a Democrat, Republican, or whatever. I'm not going to get into politics here, but you have these people with their entrenched beliefs, and it's easy to demonize the one or the other and be like, you shouldn't exist anymore, or whatever. That's not helpful, as we know. That just creates more battles. But if you try to sit in between, like, okay, let me listen to this person with an opposing political opinion without judgment. Let me just hear them. And, maybe what they say is not truthful. Maybe there's lies or misinformation, but maybe there's some nuggets of truth in there as well. and they're clearly coming at this from something is driving them, versus that person could do the same with me, and I think if we learn just in our social life, but also our inner life, to not exist in either pole, but to exist more in the middle, that would solve a lot of our problems.
Yeah, well, let me know when you've mastered that.
It's a kind of work in progress. And that's, coming back to the physiology, that's working through the heart. That's working through the breathing rhythms and the warmth of the heart. So connecting with heart thinking, that's really part of this process. And that's what I think is a culture in general we're working on right now. We're kind of coming to an end of an old way of thinking. In fact, the whole crisis we're seeing around us is really more than just the pandemic or whatnot. It's actually a crisis of also, was our economy working? Was all this other stuff working? Plus social systems, political systems, and a lot of people are deciding, no, it's not working. And what do I now replace it with? Unfortunately, what happens, they just polarize to another end, instead of like the truth is actually somewhere in that gray zone in the middle, and that can pull us out of this battle that we're heading into.
Yeah. Well, I have so many more questions, but maybe we should wrap up for the day.
With plenty more episodes we can explore this stuff with.
Yeah, next time, the relationship to what's going on now and the concept of the age of Aquarius, which I think will be fitting for the 7th episode of still doing the planetary rhythms and organ systems.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, there's still a lot more we can talk about with the etheric forces. And, today I intended to talk a little bit more about terrain and all of that, but I think we got a little sidetracked into other issues here. But that's fine. I mean, that's good to have this discussion. But I think I can come at the terrain maybe next time a little bit more. But then, yeah, we need to jump from the etheric to the psychic level. In a way, as I pointed out last time, we can think of the etheric as a counter image to physical space. The psychic is 90 degrees perpendicular to that space. It's beyond space. It's more of an inwardness. And so there we have to look at what are those forces working there and acting through that space. And that brings us to the psychic level. So we will build up to that slowly.
Great. Well, I since we're on Brainwaves, I just have to say it. So I did have a very visceral experience maybe this is my kidney Qi bubbling up when it should be going back into storage. But I did have a visceral experience of what these different brainwave states kind of felt like in my body, but the experience that I was thinking of for the gamma wave state was almost as if, every direction you look, you could peer into something and see the very end of that thing. So like almost an accelerated, I see the consequences of this action to the nth degree, or I look this direction and it's almost as if, being in a dream and you look a certain direction and a new field of scenery is generated and you can see all the way to the end of that. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, I mean, the way the gamma states are described is usually like under very intense, even ecstatic conditions. Sometimes they talk about like an airplane pilot who's landing a plane in a crash. They're in this heightened state of awareness. They're very aware, but in a different sense than the beta brainwave awareness. And it makes sense that maybe you're tapping into a different fabric there. You're starting to see a little bit more of the interconnectedness, as we talk about the etheric is really a non-local unity that ties, that is kind of the state from which physical matter comes out of. So maybe you're tapping into that a little bit more. So it's, I think though that those gamma states to come about, you almost need to be in the lower states first. That going from beta to gamma is very difficult. You almost have to go down into alpha and theta, and then you can jump to gamma. So it's like you got to get into that relaxed state first.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it reminds me of like people in sleep tanks, uh, stories of people who've gone into these sensory deprivation tanks, and then they get into an extremely relaxed state, and then they write a whole book, or they come up with a whole thesis while they're in these kind of altered states of awareness. And it's like first they had to relax deeply to get there, and then there was almost on the flip side.
Yeah,
This,
like coming through the other end, right? Yeah,
yeah,
going through the gate.
yeah. It's like
Yeah.
waking cognition, but with an extra like.
Yeah, you got. I mean, that imagery is in alchemy and mythology. It's going to the underworld. You go to the underworld first, and then you have these experiences. So you have to get into these lower, and we're literally in the brain as you go in these lower brainwave states. It's like we're getting into going from, most of our day-to-day cognition happens in just a couple millimeters of the outer surface of your brain, the so-called cerebral cortex. It's only 6 neurons deep, but that's where all your language centers, your cognitive center, their major cognitive centers are all located in that 6 neuron deep layer. And that's your beta brainwave activity. But as you sink into alpha and lower, you're actually getting more into your limbic and then brainstem. You could say you're almost sinking into there. And that's really the image physically of going into the underworld. And when you're underworld, then you can start to get into this different fabric of the universe. And then we would measure that as a jump up into gamma. So yeah, but you got to go down into the underworld first before you get there.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of people who take psychedelics, and there's like this dark night of the soul experience where they're kind of coming to terms with various aspects of themselves, and then on the other side there's this beautiful but that's for another day.
No, that's the whole experience of meditation in general, is you got to go through the dark night of the soul first, and then you come out the other end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess the light never lasts forever, but if you're smart, you can learn to extend it and to see the darkness before maybe you get entangled with it.
Yeah, it's a matter of contrast. I mean, in a way, you wouldn't know what's light unless you have the dark there. So you have to kind of go through that part first.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to add before we close out the episode?
That was a long one. I think we hit it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just as long as last week's, it looks like. All right. Well, if, yeah, for all you listening out there, definitely feel free to leave comments, ask questions. We want your feedback. We need your feedback. Strong word, need, but we need it. And it would really help us to kind of get a sense of where you are at. And, I would just encourage you to, when you feel life as you're listening to these conversations, write it down. Like, we're here to answer your questions. We can hold more active Q&A sessions where it's more, lively and really, engage with you. And so, yeah, write down your questions and put them in the comments, but know that if there's enough interest, we can also host Q&A sessions or something like it in the future. So yeah, apart from that, also share with your friends and any like minds. Again, like, we want to get the word out for this channel. We want to build it. Yeah, I know it's very, just share. And then definitely, if you haven't yet, but if you're listening to this episode, you probably subscribed already. But if you haven't yet, click the subscribe button hit the thumbs up, and yeah, share with your friends and family and those who you feel would really resonate with and be helped by and nurtured by what we're talking about. So my name is Motoyuki.
I'm Paul Kalnins.
And this was another episode of, maybe we should say this one together too.
Enliven
Medicine. Great. All right.
See you later.
Until next time.